Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, we are truly honored to be joined by a tremendously talented actor, singer, dancer, instructor, choreographer, Academy Award winner for his iconic role as Bernardo in the 1961 classic film West Side Story, and the author of a wonderful new autobiography entitled My West Side Story, a Memoir, Mr. George Chakiris. Welcome, George.
Hey, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I
Are you where are you?
I'm in Brentwood,
Oh, okay, okay.
so I'm right here, and um, whoops, and I forgot to turn off my phone. Okay, so that was the first mistake I made. So the people who've been listening to my show for the last 2 years, they know that one of the first things I talk about is where we get our first film education. And I know from reading your autobiography that you were a film goer from an early age.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about the movie theaters that you remember from your youth and what you were watching in those movie theaters. I know you traveled around a little bit as a youth. I know you started in the East Coast and gradually came west.
Yes, well, that's how I was born in Ohio. My family then moved to Tucson, Arizona for a while. Then we moved to Miami, Florida for a while. Then we moved back to Tucson for a while. And we finally ended up in Long Beach, California. But in those, the kinds of theaters that you remember the theaters where the box office was separate and out front on the pavement, more or less, with nice little curls and swirls and things like that in the design. That's what I remember the box office kind of looking like, like a glamorous swirls and curls and things. And so, you know, young people, or I suppose anyone, we're we're exposed much more, in fact, maybe completely to film than we ever are of theater. The reason I say that is because even though I didn't start studying dance till I was 19, I had no idea that theater existed. I thought the world was movies. And I the kinds of I think I liked all kinds of movies as a kid growing up, but I think I especially liked things in color and movie musicals or romantic stories. One of the romantic stories that I remember that I liked very much was a movie with Tyrone Power called Captain from Castile. And that
Sure, sure.
just I can't tell you why it grabbed me, but it did. The love story was kind of mysterious as well. So there's something about the love story in that movie was intriguing. Because
By the way, my mother told me that we first, because I'm originally from Chicago, my mother told me when we first came out to LA to visit my uncle, we were in the Los Angeles airport, and my mother says that Tyrone Power came over and picked me up in his arms. I was 3 years old, and told me how cute I was. And my mother was swooning, and my father was giving her dirty looks. But but I think I've always had a fondness for Tyrone Power since then. And I remember Captain from Castile very well because the first movie series I ever watched on TV was 1962. Saturday Night at the Movies was the first primetime
uh-huh.
TV series, and their first season was all 20th Century Fox titles, and
Okay.
Captains from Castile was one of them.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess, of course, you would have a fond memory of a man who was nice enough to come over and pay attention to you and embrace you and so on. Also, that to us, I think probably and probably correctly speaks in some way to what he was like as a person and makes you like him even more.
You were starting to get your way in Hollywood in the 50s and even earlier than that. Did you ever meet Tyrone Power in person?
No, I didn't. Although I wish he was one of those that because in my mind, he was one of the great movie stars, and especially because of Captain Castile and Jean Peters also, because she was in that film as well. But
Sure.
yeah, but Tyrone Power was mega, 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 there's a great movie he does with Myrna Loy called The Rains Came, I think it's called. It's black and white. He is so beautiful in that film, and it's such a good movie. And I wonder how, at that time, I think it was in the 30s, did they manage all those special effects, which remain perfect to this day? Yeah.
Yeah, you watch the original King Kong 1933 and you marvel at the marvelous special effects of Willis O'Brien and creating that ape, which was so interesting. You also mentioned in your autobiography that you were just a big Fred Astaire fan and you
Yeah.
loved the musicals he did with Ginger Rogers.
Right. With the musicals, it took me a long time to pay any attention to the guys, to Fred Astaire. I was watching the women with their skirts swirling, and to me, the glamour came from them. But of course, later in life, I began to appreciate, oh God, Fred Astaire. What an extraordinary, extraordinary man he was, and what he did on he was so incredible. But I didn't appreciate that to begin with. I just thought all the women looked great.
Well, you were watching musicals. I was watching science fiction movies. By the early 50s, or actually mid 50s, when we moved out to California, we lived across the street from a movie theater, the old stadium on Pico,
Uh-huh.
which has been a temple for 60 years. But for me, it was a temple, but a different kind of a temple. It was a temple of great movies. So I
Yeah.
have to start off my questions for you that you'll laugh because I don't even know if you have the answer to this, but I'm going to put up a picture. And for the people who are listening to this audio wise, and we hope to have the video on, I'm about to show George a picture of Steve McQueen and Leonardo DiCaprio. And I don't know if you saw the latest Tarantino, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
No,
but
I didn't. I
there's,
didn't.
oh, you did or you didn't?
I did not see
Oh, you
it.
did not. Okay, so it's a it's a wildly crazy movie, but there is a scene where Leo DiCaprio plays an actor, kind of like a Western TV star who's kind of having a speed bump in his career, and he's talking to somebody about the roles he didn't get, and he suddenly mentions Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, 1963, and he says that he was up for it. And they actually show Leonardo DiCaprio doing a scene that Steve McQueen did, but he says something in dialogue that's kind of funny. He said, no, no, I wasn't up. But it would start out with the three Georges. He says George Papard, George Maharis, and George Chakiris. He says that in dialogue. So
Okay.
I have to ask you the question. I think you had worked for John Sturges, the director in Girl Rush. I think that was Sturges.
I was a chorus dancer in the Girl Rush, but I never met John Sturges. I didn't know he was there because the choreographer for the film, who was Robert Alton, he was who we were beholden to.
Oh,
The dancer. So, and I think probably, Robert Alton was a very famous, very admired choreographer. And I think whenever he did any movie, the director never had to come in. Bob Robert Alton was free to do exactly what he wanted. So if Mr. Sturgis walked in, I would never have known.
so here's the question. Did you ever audition for The Great Escape?
No,
Okay,
no.
so obviously Quentin Tarantino made that up in dialogue. So there you go. There's a spoiler. Now I'm going to put up another image, which I was delighted to discover in your filmography, that you did some dance instruction on the movie The Court Jester in '56. So, well, The Court Jester to me is one of the great comedy spoof homages of all time for costume movies. Tell us a little bit about what you remember on that.
Wow. Well, again, the for the that sequence for Danny, he was so incredible. When I was a lad, it was gloomy and sad, but from the day I was born, I mean, full of those. His wife wrote the song, which is very, 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 very wordy. And Danny Kaye does it like no one else. But Robert Alton was hired to do that musical sequence for Danny. And Robert Alton hired me as a male assistant, and he hired a lovely woman whose name was Joan Beamer as his female assistant. And we worked at Paramount. I never quite knew what happened to that sequence because we did work on it, but I think something in the final film is different. I really don't know. But again, we worked for Robert Alton, who was the choreographer. That's who we were, I'll say, beholden to. And by the way, we all loved working for him because he did so many things. Um, but and I can tell you one little funny story that I kind of remember. It has nothing to do with filmmaking, but Danny had one of those great dressing rooms at Paramount. You know, when you walk in, it's over beautiful, beautiful dressing room. And one afternoon, we were all in his dressing room, Sylvia Fine and whoever else was involved, just I guess for a break or they had something to talk about. I was just there. Well, I didn't have anything to say. Obviously, I just sat and listened. And while we're sitting there, they were talking to each other. The door to the dressing room opened, and kind of falling in backwards was Jerry Lewis, as if he was trying to catch a ball. And he looked around. He thought he was going to be funny. He thought he was making a joke, and maybe he was, but nobody laughed. And so he just quietly left.
Now, Danny Kaye, over the years, I've heard various stories about Danny Kaye that he could be impossible. But if I think in the history of show business, nobody was more unique in his talents than Danny in terms of song and dance and just pure humor. What
Yeah.
was your impression of Danny? Because I know you worked with him on White Christmas as well.
Oh God, yeah, yeah. Well, my best impression is from the, the the other one. He was he was lovely. He was really great. I think he was at that time. I had just prior, I think, to this film, been in a movie called White Christmas with Rosemary Clooney, and I was one of four guys in a number with Rosemary, and each of us, there were four of us in that number, sorry, and each of us had a sort of mini shot, you know, not a close-up, but a medium shot with her in the course of the number. And there was a spread in Life magazine, like about White Christmas at that time, and they had a picture of Rosie with the four guys around her. To make a long story short, I started getting a lot of fan mail, and nobody knew who I was, and I didn't know I was getting it. And one day when I was working on The Girl Rush, the producer of that film came to the rehearsal, and he had all these letters with him. He said, I think we should do something with this boy. So I'm sort of getting into how Danny was a great help because thanks to that medium shot with Rosie and White Christmas, and thanks to the producer of White Christmas and of The Girl Rush, he encouraged them to test me as a player to Paramount Pictures, and they did. And I did a musical test, I did an acting test, but before anything had been decided, I think I've got my timeline pretty close to right. I was before anything actually happened, before I was actually put under contract at Paramount, I was already working with Danny on The Court Jester, and he was so encouraging to me. He really wanted me to be under contract. My point is, I don't know how, but he was instrumental in the nicest possible way to say, to help me get along. I have a pair of gold cufflinks with monogram, my initials monogram that Danny gave me. And so he was nice to me. As far as I could, he was nice to everybody. And he was bright, he was funny, all of that we know. But I really appreciated his efforts to try and help get George under contract. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
to show you how I feel about his talent, I thought once that maybe we could remake The Court Jester for a more modern audience And
Uh-huh.
to think of casting somebody to play the Danny Kaye role is almost impossible today to
Yeah,
find
yeah.
someone with that much varied talent. Now I'm going to put up another picture here that's actually predates The Court Jester. And this is a movie that I remember seeing on Saturday morning television, and I didn't know what to make of it. It was like a dream sequence, but it's based on a Dr. Seuss. It's called The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. And of course, the little boy here is Tommy Rettig, who people remember from the Lassie TV series. But I learned that you actually had some involvement choreographing this as well.
Well, not choreographing it, but Eugene Loring, my first dance class, first thing I did professionally was take a dance class at the American School of Dance in Hollywood Boulevard. It was a very respected ballet school. Ballet was the most important thing and the primary thing that they taught. And all the ballet companies, when they were touring and came to Los Angeles, always went to that school for class. Anyway, Eugene Loring was contracted to do that the dungeon scene, that number with Tommy Rettig and all the guys as instruments, and but in the guild at that time, it was everybody was there was no screen. It was at the Screen Extras Guild, and Mr. Loring needed 60 male dancers for that sequence, and at the time there weren't that many male dancers in the union. So some of us who were non-union got to audition for Mr. Loring, and I was lucky enough to be hired. And so that meant that, and I also made enough money working on a movie that enabled me to join the union and then go out on auditions for other things too. So the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T was my first professional job, you know. Yeah.
Well, the for the listeners and viewers who've never seen this movie, it's kind of a marvelous dreamlike movie about a little boy who doesn't like taking piano lessons and ends up in a world where literally the biggest piano in the history of man is created with keys for probably 200 young boys.
Yeah.
And I think Hans Conried, the wonderful character actor, plays the teacher, kind of like a tyrannical character. And it's filled with imagery, and we were amazed later on to discover it was based on a Dr. Seuss
Yeah.
created piece. Uh,
Yes.
but definitely a fun thing. So I'm glad we mentioned that movie. Let me
And
pull up.
by the way, weren't the sets in that film wonderful? Do you remember them?
I do. They were very fantastical. They were just something just like out of a dream. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
one of your earlier films where you were working as a dancer is another one of my favorites, which of course is Gene Kelly and Sid Charisse and Brigadoon. And I've seen some of the still photography now, and you have it in your book. I'm realizing that when the wedding sequence in the movie, you are one of the performers in the wedding sequence.
Yes, I am. Yeah. Let's see. I was in I'll say the crowd sequences. You know, just because I was lucky to be working, and and then also in the movie was the sword dance with Hugh Lang played the protagonist, I think, and Gene Kelly choreographed the sword dance, which is basically Scottish dancing on the balls of her feet endlessly over crossed swords. And so I was one of the guys in that sequence. And my understanding, I don't know how it stands now, but I understand that that sequence was cut from the original film.
It
And
was because you're mentioning the sword sequence. I have no idea what you're talking about.
okay, well, that's what it was the sword dance. It was that's what it was called, the sword dance. And Gene again staged it. He was so great to work with, and the hard thing for us, you know, dancing on the balls of your feet for that many hours, that many days, you can't help but get what they call shin splints, which is serious kind of pain
Sure.
that goes
Why did you have to dance on the balls of your feet?
because that's what the sword dance was. You dance on your on the toes, the balls of your feet. That's just the way
And
Scottish.
are you fighting? And I mean, when you say sword dance, I assume there's some fighting involved.
No, there's no fighting. It's just a musical number and I guess because it was that's probably why it could be lifted from the film and not necessarily missed, because it's
Right.
not necessarily part of the story. It's just, I guess, the powers that be, and maybe it was in the original theater as well, I don't know, felt that okay, we're in Scotland, we need a Scottish dance. And they did that, again, with Dean and with three other fellows and myself, and dancing over the cross swords. It was, I was so glad to be there. And then, again, Gene was so nice. He took such great care of his dancers. But it was cut from the film. I've seen the film, and I've seen it in the version without the sword dance. So I don't know whatever happened to the sword dance.
I know that Gene was very disappointed that the budget was cut, that they could not go to Scotland to make the movie, that it was all done on those MGM sound stages. You probably remember those stages very well.
Remember what?
The stages where they made
Oh, yes, yeah. I've heard that, understood that story as well, that Gene wanted to go really be in Scotland. I personally think that because it's a kind of fantasy in a way, the story edges on that. I think the look of all the sets, exteriors and so on, are perfect for this particular film. It's just it keeps it kind of dreamy and a sort of unbelievable kind of place.
Well, it's a story that Hollywood seems to somewhat have abandoned, the idea of romance and fantasy. It just seemed like I mean, it's a very romantic film, and of course, Gene and Sid are just wonderful together. What do you remember about the wedding? I mean, there's a huge number of people in that wedding sequence, and
Yes.
of course, um, now I think Vincent Minnelli is the director.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit about what it was like being on such a huge enterprise like that.
Well, I was just a chorus dancer and thought as a chorus dancer and just thought I'm just lucky to have a job. So I didn't view it pretty much any other way, except I did like working on it. I remember the crowd scenes, Come Ye to the Square, where there are lots of people on that set. But Gene was staged, choreographed, and with Gene and with Vincent. So of course everything works. I just remember the only thing that I remember about that film really is what a lovely experience it was. And I remember Sid coming to rehearsal one day. There were a few of us sitting around waiting for things to start. And Sid quietly came in by herself. She didn't say hello. She just passed us very gently. And one of the kids by us thought she was rude because she didn't say hello. And I thought, give her a break. She's working. But but in the wedding scene, that Jimmy Thompson plays the groom, and
Here, let's see if I remember his character name. Charlie,
yeah.
Charlie Dalrymple.
Well, I'll tell you, every once in a few nights ago on TCM, I saw George, God, what was the movie? Um, uh, where they were turning the barn into a place for a show.
That sounds like every Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney movie.
Okay, well, it's one of those. And and why am I mentioning this? Because Jimmy Thompson and Singing in the Rain and Brigadoon and one other film that I can't think of right now is very prominently featured. He was a wonderful actor, a wonderful singer, a wonderful dancer, and he had those three opportunities. When I see him, sometimes I do think to myself, "Good Lord, whatever happened to Jimmy? Look how good he was, and the opportunities he had, and why didn't something lead to more for him?" Things like that cross my mind. But he was one step away from being a musical star if he had been given the opportunity. It's hard for me not to mention him. I wish they would mention people like him on TCM because he needs recognition.
Well, someone pointed out to me that the original stage production of the Lerner and Loewe Brigadoon was less about dance more about the songs, but when Gene came on, that there's much more dancing, good dancing
Right.
in Brigadoon. And of course, that's that wonderful duo with him and Van Johnson where they're showing off their tapping skills must have
Uh-huh.
been a joy to watch.
Sure. Yeah. 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 It was because I let's see. What am I thinking? Well, of course, the character Van Johnson plays. Maybe that's just the way he looked to me as we were watching him. That sort of blasé, whatever.
He was downright cynical, and he did not think of
Yeah.
anything this.
Yeah.
Now, when you were growing up, George, obviously you'd seen all those musicals in the movies. What kind of dancing did you first gravitate towards? Were you interested in ballroom dancing? I mean, what were your first dancing licks?
I never knew that there were categories of dance, ballroom, ballet, tap. That I never knew any of that. I just know that the people I saw that they all danced. I didn't appreciate the technical side of dancing at all because I didn't know. Obviously, I learned a lot later about that, but I was more taken by. Um, some things you always like more than others, and sometimes I think we have feelings that about certain stars whose personalities grab us more than perhaps someone else. For example, Sid was well, first of all, she's such a glorious. I didn't have to know anything about dance to appreciate her. She was flawless and beautiful and moved through, and she had extraordinary, serious ballet training, and she moved through space just beautifully. And I think not that wasn't just her training; it was her talent. It was the way she moved. It was the way she approached dance was really very, very beautiful, like her. The Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies, it took me a long time to appreciate those. Of course, I do now. And he was so amazing. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question now. But the things that I'll say the dreamiest things for me as a kid growing up when I went to the movies, the things that I loved the most were musicals and musical sequences. And very often what I could do is I'd go by myself because I had more fun that way. And I could walk home along the beach on the way home and just instinctively try to remember some of the songs I'd seen and try to sing them to myself. I was still in that world, which I didn't want to leave that world. It was so great, you know.
Sure, sure. Well, speaking of great dancing, I am going to put up another image that I think will put a smile to your face. And that, of course, is working with the wonderful Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen. It's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, correct?
Right. Yes.
Now, this image, and again, sorry for this to the audio listeners, but I have an image of Marilyn in that gorgeous dress, and then just to the right of her, we can
Yeah.
see George as one of the
Yeah.
dancers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you had become a little familiar with Marilyn because you had worked with her before, correct?
I never became familiar with her. I never spoke to her, but I was around her a few different times. First on working on this film, and every, all the times I was around Marilyn Monroe, the thing that I walked away with, first of all, I'll start with the working on this number, which is such a great number by Jack Cole. And by the way, you probably know how much Marilyn loved Jack Cole and always wanted him more than anybody else, and usually got him more than anybody else. But okay, in the filming of this set, of this movie, Natasha Lytess was on the set. She was quiet, but Marilyn was quiet. And if they yelled cut for any reason, she didn't look in the mirror. She didn't comb her hair. She did nothing. She's right back to her starting position to start again. And to me, I think that shows how she cared about her work and that she didn't the main thing was the work and how serious and how much she cared about the work. I think most people do, but I always thought about her that somehow the caring went a little deeper. I'm not sure. But so I got to work on that. There was one time in the break of that when they were filming. Something I did not hear, but I could watch them. And Marilyn, Jack Cole was talking to Marilyn, facing her, giving her, I assume, a note of some kind. And directly behind him, on notes to him, was Natasha Lytess. So Marilyn was looking at both of them at the same time, having to pay attention to both. But Jack Cole didn't know that Natasha Lytess was behind him. Am I picking
Yeah,
this
and
clear?
I should also explain to the listeners that Natasha Lytess was Marilyn Monroe's acting coach, correct?
Right, that's right. But
So mixed signals could drive anybody crazy, but I
yeah,
assume that Marilyn probably paid more attention to Jack than Natasha.
ultimately probably so. But at that someone like that, she was courteous to both of them. Is my point.
How would you describe seeing Marilyn Monroe in action to somebody who had no idea who that was? How would you describe the experience?
Wow. Well, she was pretty stunning to look at. And she moved really, really, really well. And she was a good singer. She was a good singer. I here and there maybe a note might have been put in for her, but she was gifted. She had she was absolutely gifted. I think she had an instinct. You know, just recently I heard someone say, can't think what it was, they were so glad that they followed their instinct. And I kind of think, I don't know anything, but I think that's what she did because she followed her instincts, and I think basically she was pretty much always right. For example, very quickly, if I can, No Business Like Show Business, which she was also in, that too was choreographed by Robert Alton, and he was going to choreograph the Heat Wave number for her, and she wanted Jack Cole. So Robert Alton knew that. So what he did one day, he went to one of the screening rooms, and she had done a movie with Richard Widmark called River of No Return, in which she does a member, I'm going to find.
Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum.
Thank you. Yeah. And she did remember the Jack Cole stage called I'm going to Find My Claim, which is a little kind of racy, but funny. It's just wonderful. And Robert Alton and his team thought, since they're going to be creating a number for Maryland, they should go and watch that number. And they did, and they watched, and a couple of sneaked along and watched it with them, you know, because we sat down in the front. And of course, we kind of got it. We thought it was funny because Jack Cole, his humor was always it was always um, a kind of sexual innuendo going on, but funny. And Robert Alton and his team all thought that it was the number was vulgar. So he staged a number for Marilyn, a heat wave number with four guys around her at the rehearsal studios at Fox. It took about 4 weeks to stage it. Again, I was one of the guys, so I got to be around her in that way. And after the 4 weeks of him creating the number, it was okay for Marilyn to come in and look at the number and see what she thought. And that's what she did. One day she came in, a very, very sunny day. She came in alone. She didn't have 5 people with her. She was by herself. She was very courteous. We did the number for her. She thanked them, and Jack Cole did the number. So she got what she wanted, and she was absolutely. We all the two choreographers the kids always loved to work for were Robert Alton and Jack Cole. So she was right about wanting Jack Cole. Robert Alton was an amazing man as well, but a very, very different style. And so the Heat Wave number in There's No Business Like Show Business, she got her way, and she was right. It's by Jack Cole.
Well, the listeners would be very disappointed if I didn't ask you some questions about West Side Story. In reading, I had no idea that when you went off to London to be in the London staged version of West Side Story, you did not play Bernardo. You played Riff, the
Right.
the Jets.
Yeah, I know. You know, in the 50s, that was 1958, I think I actually got the job, but
Right.
in the 50s, it felt to all the dancers here on the West Coast that there was less work as a dancer because there was less work for dancers. So I thought to myself, well, maybe I should go to New York. And I had a couple of friends who had already made that move, and I decided to go to New York. I got a one-way ticket, and my friends put me up on the couch in their living room, so I had a place to stay. And because they were there ahead of me, and one of them worked for Roger L. Stevens, who was a tremendous, very, very important theatrical producer. So these two girls knew everything that was going on, and they told me what to do. West Side Story, of course, was playing at the Winter Garden Theater. It was coming up to its 1 year anniversary in the theater, not quite. And so my friend Drusilla Davis told me to go to the Winter Theater at the end of the day and ask for Ruth Mitchell, who was the stage manager of West Side Story at that time. She later became Hal Prince's associate producer, but then she was the stage manager for West Side. So I went to the Winter Garden Theater. I managed to meet Ruth Mitchell. She was very, very nice. And she looked at me and she said, I think you should read for Bernardo. And she gave me a script. And she set up a time for me to come in a couple of weeks later, whatever, to read for Jerry, which I did. And so I saw it was first I met Jerry was I mean I didn't know I didn't know what amazing people I was meeting.
So for the listeners, when you say Jerry, you're talking about Jerome
Jerry
Hellman, who was the
Robbins, yes, yeah.
great
Because
choreographer.
listen, West Side Story in any way, shape, or form would never exist if it wasn't for Jerry Robbins, because he brought it to life, created it, and all of that. So
By the way, I just made a terrible faux pas. I referred to him as Jerome Hellman. Jerome Robbins, of course. I'm guilty of that myself. So you went off to England and you played Riff. Um, and then, of course, and that was a big, so you were there for 2 years. It was very successful.
I was there for a year and a half
Oh, year and a
before,
half.
yes, and
And
Cheetah was the original Anita, so I got to work with Cheetah and some pretty nice people. Yeah,
and then, of course, they're casting for the movie.
right.
And we go back to Bernardo. Now, I have to tell you that I take movies and I put them on digital files. I play them in the car, and
Uh-huh,
I probably play the America theme with you and
uh-huh,
Rita. I
uh-huh.
probably played it 1,000 times. The energy level in that number is just so off the charts.
Yeah.
And you and Rito, I know, are very close. Can you talk a little bit about that number specifically and what you remember?
Well, first of all, in retrospect, I can now be grateful for the change, whereas because the American number in the theater version was the girls only, and in the film version it was the girls and the guys, and that created a whole different dynamic, a competition, playful competition from between the guys and the girls, and we had the best time in the world. I mean, we just did. It never stopped. Between shots, when we were waiting for some lights or something like that, we just kept playing. It was an ongoing, delicious thing that we're all going through. We all got funny. We all got funny, and we all played games on each other, but at all times keeping the seriousness of it in very clearly in mind. But it was just delicious. It was just so wonderful. We had such a great time. And one of our girls, the girl in the American number, there's when Rita says, "I like to live in Manhattan." There's one of the girls in the back says, "I know you do."
Yeah,
And so
who is that?
that's Yvonne Wilder. Yvonne was Cheetah's understudy in London. And so when the film came around, of course, she was used in the film as well. But if I love mentioning Yvonne because Yvonne had a very, very unique and special kind of humor that we all took on and adopted. And it just permeated the entire experience. I guess when they were doing the shooting cool, they didn't play around that way because of a different atmosphere. But for the American number, it's playful,
I I think she's also in the sequence in the wedding shop just prior to singing I Feel Pretty. I think she's also one of the girls,
She is.
Natalie,
She is. That's
and
right.
she is funny. Now let me ask you, first of all, the America number in the film shoot, was that early in the film shoot or was that later in the film shoot? Do you remember where it popped in?
What popped in? Sorry.
The America sequence that you were talking about with you and Rita and all the girls and guys, was that shot early in the show or was that shot
Well,
toward the end?
I really am not. I'm not sure. I don't think early, because the very first thing we shot was the prologue, the location work in New York, and then
So
we
the America sequence was shot on a soundstage back in California.
yes, it was, yeah, on a rooftop built by our incredible stage designer. He was amazing. Yeah, um, and
Now,
yeah, it's. I'm just even thinking about all this. It's such a pleasure to think about this because we really did. We loved what we were doing so much,
well, in the
and
history of musicals, I would have to say that there's so many numbers in, of course, in the movie that stand out for me, but that would have to be in the top 10 of all time. Now, this is an unusual situation because Jerome Robbins is listed as a director, and then of course you had the great Robert Wise as a
right.
director. In the daily operation of the set, I know that there was later some turbulence and Jerome was fired. I know all about that
Mhm.
because I guess he was perhaps too much of a perfectionist and slowed down production.
That's
But
right.
when he was working there, how would you describe the relationship between him and Mr. Wise? Were they working well together?
I think they did work well together. And the way I imagined it, I couldn't be sure, was that Jerry was on the floor with us, and Bob Wise was the father figure out here who knew film and understood, but could oversee everything that was happening. But the person who most prominently actually directed us on the floor was Jerry. And that's not to speak badly of Bob Wise. And let me say one other thing, because something I always forget. Before we left for New York to shoot the prologue in New York, that's the first thing we shot. Before any of that happened, we had rehearsed for months every scene, every song, and every musical number. So everybody knew what they had to do before filming ever started. And the reason I say that is because sometimes we think Bob did this, Jerry did that, but the bottom line, we were so well rehearsed. Whoever was directing, we knew what we had to do. But there was a difference in. I'm speaking for myself. To me, when Jerry, we'd get to rehearsal and have a cup of coffee and then do a ballet bar to warm up and be ready for work. And then Jerry would arrive quietly with a smile. He didn't make noise. But when Jerry arrived, the way I like to express it, because I don't know another way to do it, is that there was electricity in the room. Oh, I just thought of something. When I was playing Riff in London, one day I was rehearsing with Jerry. And Jerry asked me very quietly, he said, "Why do you think he's called Riff?" That's a great question. It made me think I had no idea why he was called Riff. But the reason I say that is Jerry, one of the things that Jerry and everybody instinctively knew it, that they had to bring things to the stage, not just to wait to be told what to do. Everybody was involved in the creative process as well. And I think that's one of the reasons it keeps it as vibrant as it is, because everybody did feel that strongly about it. But again, I think Jerry's way, you just my biggest wish was to do that, to absolutely bring something more to what we were doing use my own imagination and so on, as opposed to just wait to be told. But again, the basic concept as I look back is Jerry was on the floor with us, directing us, and Bob Wise, I'll say the father figure, overseeing everything as it happened.
So tell me, what does riff mean?
I've never known. But I'll tell you what, I have thought a riff, a musical riff and a phrase. So I thought a riff, maybe that could affect the way he moves. Something like, I never actually used it because it took me a long while to come to any conclusion about it. But even now, as I'm talking about it, I think that possibly the way you could take the what does his name mean, could mean a musical riff, and if it's a musical, that could in some way affect the way he moves as an
Oh,
actor, not just as a
oh,
dancer.
I'm working on getting Mr. Tamblyn on the show because he also has a new book out.
That's
And
right.
if I'm blessed to have Russ on the show, I will ask him that question.
Okay.
Um, just wonderful work on the show, George, and of course we have it forever. I mean, people 100 years from now can pop on whatever format they have 100 years from now, but we
Yeah,
can watch these musical numbers now. Um, you you were blessed with an Oscar nomination, and then of course on the night of the Oscars in '62, you won the Oscar. Who were you sitting next to in the audience that night?
I was sitting next to Rita Moreno, and we went together. Um, the car came and got me first, and then when we went to pick her up, and she came out of her door saying, "I'm practicing my loser's face." And what I can say is, what an incredible night. I mean, two young people with this stuff pending and who were good friends. They go to this event together. They both get lucky. I mean, there's no a better night. That night doesn't exist. You know, it was it was. There will never be enough words to express how
So
tremendous.
what do you remember? And I know it's like one of those moments that you never forget when they called your. First of all, I should know this, but who was announcing the best supporting actor that night? Who was it?
Shirley Jones.
Shirley Jones, who had won the previous year for Elmer Gantry. So Shirley Jones announces George Chakiris, Best Supporting Actor. What did you feel at that moment?
Well, I'm not sure I felt anything, but I just the surprise. I don't know. It all gets kind of I'll say very hard to describe. At least for me, kind of.
Did you win first, or did Rita win first?
My category came up first.
Okay.
Yeah, and let's see, and I remember, it was a strong year, competitive, with the actors who had been nominated and so on. So when I think back, I think, good Lord, that wasn't, how lucky was that to win that in that category to begin with, but against some of those extraordinary actors, not just McCartney Clift is enough to wipe.
Well, my personal opinion that you were electricity personified as Bernardo, and I'm so happy you were honored that night. Now, I'm going to turn the page a little bit because we're running out of time. I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention a movie that I actually watched yesterday. I hadn't seen it in many years, so I popped on Tubi, which is one of the channels, a copy of Kings of the Sun, and it's funny because I hadn't seen it in many years, but I thought that, and I know the movie's had a few brickbats over the years, but I have to tell you, in watching it today, there's a lot of energy in this movie and certainly production value up the yin yang. And I thought it was a good role for you. Do you have fond memories of Kings of the Sun?
Well, ultimately, yes. In the beginning, I didn't want to do it. It was a mirror part of the deal with the Mirrors company, and it was something the thing that bothered me to begin with, because I saw the costumes long before we ever filmed, and I thought, I don't know, it didn't feel comfortable somehow to me. I don't know how to say it, but eventually we were with Lee J. Thompson, Shirley Ann Field, who's so darling, and of course you. It was I really appreciated the experience after once I was actually and of course the thing is, you can have be worried about something to begin with, but once you're involved and you have to give it everything you have, as if you have to, both of you have to love everything you do. And I did end up appreciate and love working on that film. Not the same as West Side Story, but
No,
nevertheless,
no.
yeah,
I interviewed J. Lee Thompson back in 1974. I wrote a book called Combat Films, and we did a whole thing on a chapter on the guns of Navarone, which I later cut from the book. But J. Lee, certainly during that period, was known for doing epic work. He was kind of like a new version of Cecil B. DeMille. And I marveled at the number of extras. Now, I believe you were working in Mexico on this project.
yes, we were. Yeah, I don't know exactly. We were near Guadalajara, and one of the temples was built out in the wilderness somewhere, so that it was accessible. It didn't take hours to get there, so that there was a set built that was used, of course. That was like a Mayan. It was a Mayan temple, and and it was close, not far from the sea because those two, the sea, it was important to see the sea at one point,
Right.
and and but it was a really wonderful location. They did it very, very well. They really did, and
Well, for the listeners who don't know the film, George plays a Mayan king who is under attack from a very bad group of raiders who have taken over his country, and now he's forced to leave, and he ends up going north across the waters to North America and meets Yul Brynner's group, which is a Native American group. I thought the concept was kind of interesting because this is a subject you never hear anybody talk about, any interaction between the Mayans and anybody in the North. And perhaps it was a bit fictionalized, but it created an interesting dynamic. And Yul Brynner, oh my God, he talk about physically fit. I've never
yeah,
seen an actor
yeah,
looking so physical. And of
yeah.
course, Yul was known for playing, physical parts. But did you have fun with him? Was it fun to work with Yul?
It was fun to work with him. It was fun. He was a very, very nice, very gregarious guy. He was made his life very comfortable. He had a beautiful dressing room. He had a sort of wall of palm fronds around it, and he lived well. He made sure that his waiting times on a film were well spent. He played Jen. I played Jen with him too. That's one of the things he loved doing. His wife was with him on this particular film, and Brad Dexter was a very good friend of yours as well, and Brad was on the film. So it was a pleasant experience, and he again, Yul was just very uh, he was so striking, physically striking. He was really quite beautiful. He has a beautiful face anyway. But he was bare-chested in this film as the American Indian, and uh, I can't think of any other actor who would have come close to be doing and being what Yul Brynner was.
Oh,
He had,
sure. You can't find a Yul Brynner today.
yeah,
But I thought that what was nice about Balaam, your character, which was very interesting because the Mayans, at least in this story, are very much believers in sacrifice. They
right,
feel the only way to change the weather or
yeah,
improve the crop production is to kill somebody. And your character is very uncomfortable with that. And I thought that was
yeah,
that was terrific. I think in the book you talk about a little bit about the odd hairstyles, and you mentioned Richard Basehart
yeah.
and Barry Morris having kind of odd hairstyles. They look a little bit awkward and uncomfortable, but I got caught up in the spectacle.
Yeah, yeah, and I just realized, and you saying that the fact that in the culture, sacrifice was human sacrifice was part of the culture, and that my character was against it. So I guess you could say well, it's a little political as well. Like one leader, a guy who was eventually could be in a position to change things, but they hadn't changed yet. But yes, but my character was very much against human sacrifice. Yeah.
And I thought it was a good part for you. Now I'm going to put up another one that I really enjoyed, a very different type of role, but it was a World War II aviation movie called 633 Squadron. And I've been studying World War II films since the end of time. In fact, my friend Steve Mitchell, we do the commentary tracks when they release the Blu-rays where we talk about the making of the movie. And we just did the 633 Squadron movie. We were the commentators on it. What do you remember about this movie?
Well, I remember Cliff Robertson, just such a great man to work with, to know and to work with, and Maria Percy again, just lovely. She taught me. We'd go to we worked in I think near L Street Studios or at L Street Studios outside of London. So whenever we went for lunch, she taught me how to make a really good salad dressing with the mustard and the vinegar or whatever it was, and the olive oil on the table in front of us. But she was beautiful, darling, unassuming, professional. Just unless that movie, there was not a bad ripple that I can remember in any way, shape, or form. And Walter Grauman was such an even-tempered, good man to take care of everybody. And again, Cliff was, Cliff was the star, and I think the star can very often set the tone of the way a set can feel. And but he was so without ego that
I think he had recently, if I'm not mistaken, may have been afterwards, he had played John F. Kennedy in the movie version of PT 109, I believe.
right.
And I also learned, I did a book, The Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, and I discovered, because Cliff was in a couple of classic episodes, and I didn't realize that his godfather was Orville Wright from the
Okay.
Wright brothers.
Okay. And
And
he was a pilot. He owned planes. He loved to fly
he
himself.
was one of the first private pilots in America. I think when they started handing out private pilot licenses, Cliff may have been either the first or in the first 10.
Oh,
In fact, I think I mentioned this in my book that when 9/11 happened in New York City, Cliff Robertson was in a private plane over the city when the attack took place, and he was told by the control towers to land immediately. So he was all about aviation. But I thought the movie was good. Being a kid and learning about World War II, you build the plastic kits, and I remember the first. Not that I built a mosquito, but I remember having great respect for the look of the mosquito. It was an interesting plane.
we got to be inside the mosquito. We didn't fly, but yeah, I thought it was as a kid when I was still in Arizona and the war had just started. Young guys were making planes from balsa wood and that kind of thing. And two of the planes that we loved to make were the Spitfire and the Mosquito.
Wow, very cool.
Cool looking planes, yeah.
Well, I think you were 8 or 9 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Do you remember that day pretty well?
I do. I remember it very well. It's kind of, I remember it was a Sunday, and I was on my way to a movie. And as I recall, it was a movie musical with Carmen Miranda. And as I was walking, it was all out in the desert, walking toward to get to the movie house. A truck pulls up. It's full of newspapers, and some of the guys who were my friends, who sold newspapers. And they just stopped and they said, "Would you like to sell newspapers today?" Nobody said why. We didn't know, but would you like to do that today? And I said, no, I'm going to a movie. so that's what I remember about that day. I was too busy going to a movie.
Sure. Now, was your father, was he, because he had dependents, was he ineligible to be in the war?
Gosh, I don't know anything about that. My parents were immigrants from what we call the old country, from Turkey, and they don't like me to say Turkey. They like me to say Asia Minor. So I never heard words in any way associated with that idea. So all I know.
They were home. They were home, and obviously. Well, George, on behalf of all the listeners, and just so nice talking to you. You've had such great experiences and such iconic experiences. Oh, I did want to say one thing. I mentioned Steve Mitchell earlier. Steve and I do the commentary tracks on the World War II movies, and we did 633 Squadron. But he told me, when you talk to George, tell him I remember him very well in one of the early episodes of Hawaii Five-0. He said that you played a terrific bad guy.
From the episodic television stuff, I was really proud of that. It was a good script. It was a good show. It was a good role, and I acquitted myself well enough, I hope. But I'm glad to hear someone say that because I really enjoyed that one.
Well, terrific. Well, on behalf of my producer, Ben Shrewsbury, I'm Steve Rubin, the host, and thank you everybody for listening and hopefully watching soon on YouTube. If you enjoy Saturday Night at the Movies, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up. George, thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, I'll give you one more plug for the book. People pick up this book. It's called My West Side Story, a memoir. You can get it at Amazon or wherever good books are sold. And it's a real good read. George is a great writer, and thank you again for listening. And George, we will stay in touch.
Well, thank you so much. And by the way, before I forget, how could I get a copy of your book?
Oh, well, I will tell you that in a moment. Let me just hit the record button.